Today's episode of the Lutheran Cartographer is brought to you by Audible. Get a free trial offer with a free audiobook at audibletrial.com/Lutheran Cartographer. The Lutheran Cartographer, Episode 22. Welcome to the Lutheran Cartographer, the podcast where we explore what it's like to be Lutheran in different places. I'm your host, Nicholas Weber. This week we are joined by Pastor Matthew Durance. He is the pastor of Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Greenleaf, Kansas, and is the vacancy pastor at St. Peter's in Barnes, Kansas. He is also the district life coordinator of the Kansas district of the LCMS. Pastor Durance, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in Greenleaf.
Well, so the shorter version of the story would go like this. Is I grew up in Michigan, Midland, Michigan, and belonged to St. John's Lutheran there, LCMS congregation. Went to parochial school until about third grade there. And it was about that time that we moved across town, and we had ended up joining the ELCA church, which was nearby. It was an old ALC church. My grandparents had gone there back in the days when the ALC and the LCMS were in fellowship together. And so we didn't think there was much difference. And throughout most of my time there in that congregation, there really wasn't. But it was about the time when I went off to college. I went to Michigan Tech University originally for civil engineering, but then about halfway through, I decided to switch my major to psychology and was going to go into education, teaching, counseling, and the like. But it was my senior year of college that I had said, well, I guess I'm going to revisit this thought of becoming a pastor, which I'd had throughout my life, but had never really taken it seriously until college graduation was upon me. And I said, well, we need to make a decision on something. So I applied to Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was after starting my studies there, it was about halfway through my first year of seminary that I started to realize there were some stark differences, not only in my confession as what I believed Lutherans believed and what we said about the scriptures and the sacraments and the like, but there was actually a great difference even between what I had remembered of my home congregation and the ELCA as a whole. As you can imagine, Minnesota Lutheranism in the ELCA is fairly left of center, to put that gently.
To put it mildly, yes.
Yeah, to put it mildly. And so I had never really considered myself a stark, conservative Christian. There were many things that the ELCA taught that I was either just ambivalent about or, just thought, well, that's fine. That's one way to look at it. It's not that big a deal. But after that, I thought, this isn't going to work. And so when I started spending some time with some like-minded, more conservative Lutherans at the seminary, classmates at the seminary, and some of the professors who were still there at the time, I seriously started to consider the crossover back to the Missouri Synod. I thought maybe my exodus was coming upon me, and thought about heading back to the Missouri Synod, but there was a lot of things that I had to consider that would be difficult for that. My wife and I had been married before I finished seminary, and we had a 6-month-old son at the time, and there was a lot of other things that just really were unknown, about what that would look like going into the Missouri Synod. Would I find a call, with that sort of thing. So with that in the back of my mind, I graduated from the SEM, and I took my first call, which was actually a 2-point parish in northeast Kansas, and which was a surprise in and of itself. Coming up from Michigan, living in Michigan most of my life. My wife was born and raised in Michigan, and it was a hard transition for us to move to Minnesota, which really wasn't that different, population-wise, geography, climate, the culture of the people, not really that different from Michigan. That was a hard sell. And then coming to Kansas, we'd never lived anywhere remotely like Kansas. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't know what to prepare for, what the people would be like. But we said, well, this is where the Lord is calling us, so I guess this is where we're going. And spent 3 years in my first parish there. It was about that time, about 2 years into my call there, that I had realized, well, this isn't going to last long. We need to make a decision. And that my wife and I both kind of came to the conclusion that coming back to the Missouri Synod was where we were to go. And so that was when I contacted Peter Lang, who at the time was the district president of Kansas here, and started conversing with him and said, hey, I'm looking to join the Missouri Synod. And so praise be to God, I went through the colloquy process, and in October of 2017, I was installed here at Bethlehem in Greenleaf, which is actually just about 50 miles southwest of my first call, the ELCA parishes that I served. And now, come to find out, we really enjoy Kansas. We've spent about 6 years now. We've lived in Kansas, and the people are wonderful. I actually do kind of appreciate having winter my entire life. I enjoy some of the warmer weather more often, and there's still good beer to drink and good food. I'm especially particular to the Kansas barbecue in Kansas City and the cuisine around here. So we're enjoying it quite a bit. And thanks be to God, I've enjoyed serving the people here at Bethlehem, and then also the people of St. Peter's Lutheran, which is a vacancy congregation I'm serving at the moment as well.
I see. Yeah, that is wonderful. So tell us a little bit more then. Greenleaf, tell us a little bit more about the geographical orientation of Greenleaf. We mentioned that it's in northeast Kansas, but for those of the listeners that have never been in the Midwest, or would you even consider Kansas Midwest as a Great Plains, help orient us geographically as to where you are in relation to some other places that our listeners might be more familiar with, for example, Kansas City.
Certainly, yeah. So, and this was something that I actually had to figure out myself. One of the jokes that I kind of look back and say, wow, that was a really silly thing to say, was when we first came to my first parish, and I started talking with some of the people on the call committee and moving in to the parsonage, I had made the mistake of considering Kansas part of the South. because this was the furthest south I'd ever lived, and so I said, they kind of looked at me like, what? So Kansas would be considered part of the Great Plains. They're kind of sometimes I've heard people refer to it as the Midwest, but some would say because it's got the Midwest culture, but it's definitely more of the Great Plains. So Greenleaf, Kansas, if you were to go from Kansas City, is about 2.5 hours straight west from Kansas City. It's part of the area known as the Flint Hills. And so when you think of Kansas, I'm sure a lot of people would say, well, the Great Plains, that means it's pretty flat, not a lot of trees. A lot of farmland, which we do have a lot of farmland, but there actually is quite a bit of wooded areas, very, very hilly. There's a lot of rock formations and kind of really cool landscape and geography around this area. For some of your listeners, if they're familiar with Kansas State University at all, Manhattan, Kansas is about an hour southeast of us. If you go straight north 2 hours, you'd be in Lincoln, Nebraska. So we're actually pretty close to the Nebraska state line. We're about 12 miles south of the state line. And so, yeah, the Topeka, obviously, of course, the capital city there. We're just shy of 2 hours from Topeka. So that's kind of where you can orient us. Greenleaf, if you tried to find Greenleaf on a map without Googling it, you take out the old paper hard copy map and you try to spot out Greenleaf, I think you'd be pretty hard to find it.
I see.
So that's about the best I could say where we are geographically.
Gotcha. So how big is Greenleaf? Is it, at least when I was in rural North Dakota, one of the measures that we used was like, oh, what's the nearest place that's big enough to have a Walmart? Is Greenleaf large enough for its own Walmart, or how does Greenleaf
Yeah.
size-wise?
So if you were to look at the census data, the last population numbers for Greenleaf, Kansas was 307. So Greenleaf is an extremely small town.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a grocery store, it's got a bank, it's got a post office, a cafe, and of course the farmers co-op. But that's about it. And then houses. So the closest Walmart for us is actually just to the north a little bit, about a half hour, in Marysville, Kansas, which would be one of the larger towns. I wouldn't say it's a spanning metropolis by any stretch, but a lot of the stuff that you would want to have is in Marysville, or you can go to Clay Center. So yeah, Greenleaf is about 300 people. So when we talk more about like kind of the culture and whatnot, I can get into a little more with that because it's a pretty interesting area.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. Let's do a little bit of that right now. Now, we've already talked about how you and your wife found a great contrast between going from Michigan to Minnesota and then to Kansas, but you also mentioned that it also has some of that Midwest culture. So help draw out for our listeners a little bit about what are some of the contrasts between Greenleaf and the other places you've been.
Well, one of the things that you note in this area is there's a lot of, culturally, I would say, the Greenleaf and the surrounding area has that heavily Germanic culture behind it. That when you think of your run-of-the-mill German Lutheran community, that's what Greenleaf, Kansas is. And so in many ways, it was a lot like the people were a lot like the folks I grew up around back in Michigan, because that was a heavily German Lutheran population. So there's all those mannerisms that go along with that, good and bad, that you can think of. The community is a very family-oriented place that they really take care of their families, but they also take care of everybody in town. You think of what a place where you walk into the post office or you walk into the grocery store, and if you don't know everybody in the grocery store, then you've gone to the wrong place. Everybody, you can greet everybody on a first name basis around here. I mean, because of course, we're very a friendly group of people, but people are also, there's a lot of relations. You find out as you go along and you spend more time here, you say, oh, I never realized that so-and-so who worked at the post office was related to, the other person who runs the cafe, or, the person who operates the nursing home. They have family in that nursing home that they run and operate, and that sort of thing. So there's a dedication in everybody's kind of view of what they're supposed to do in their vocation, and then also in how they treat one another, that it's a very warm, friendly community. Now, that being said, I mean, it does take a little while to get yourself brought into the community. I mean, if you're, such as myself, we don't have any family from here. We don't have any, real connections to the community other than, I was called as the pastor here, and we've only been here for just shy of 3 years. It does take some time to kind of get to know people and have them open up a little bit more. But, once you've spent some time here and you really show an appreciation to the community, they'll claim you as one of their own almost right away. But so that was a big stark difference from coming from Minnesota, and really why it was such a hard transition going from Michigan to Minnesota rather than from Michigan to Kansas, was because Minnesota has that very different, Scandinavian Lutheran, background. And so, you would think that as Lutherans, there's not a lot of difference between, whether you're a Norwegian Lutheran, Scandinavian, Finnish, German, Danish, whatever you may be. But, I think those cultural boundaries, really more than geography, are the things you notice, because you could say the same thing about even just from my last call, which was in Kansas. But my last church was a Swedish, Lutheran congregation, and coming from the Swedish Scandinavian background to the German background, that was a transition in and of itself, even though we only went, one county over.
Yeah. So let's drill in a little bit more to this. I think that Germanic Scandinavian contrast is something that you know it when you see it and you kind of feel it a bit. How would you articulate it for those that haven't been in a German Lutheran church or a Scandinavian Lutheran church to understand that better? What some of those mannerisms or ways of being might be?
Yeah. Well, and so that's a pretty difficult question, because you're right in what you said. You know it when you see it, but trying to articulate it would be, I need to try to formulate my words here and think about that. One of the things in right off the bat is just how they. When I'm thinking about the two parishes that I've served in my time as a pastor, and I think one of the main differences is that the German Lutherans are much more pragmatic in how they approach things. When I've done, pastoral care or teaching or, looking at things in the congregation and making suggestions on how we, if we wanted to change something in the service, they had a practice that, we wanted to try to, do something different to what they've usually done, or, consider, well, let's look at this approach and how we've been looking at Bible study or Sunday school and the like. And you need to formulate your arguments based more on pragmatism and say, well, look, this is the way we've been doing things, and here's some of the shortfalls to how we have that process. Let's look at this process and make it a little more, concrete. Say, this is going to make things better. Your machine is inefficient right now. Let's fix the machine and make it more efficient. And that's how they approach a lot of things. Is they want to have things working as best they can. Whereas with the Scandinavian Lutheran, they are much more, not that the German Lutheran wouldn't, but you have to appeal more to the argument of emotion, if you would. When there were things in my former call, they were much less worried about, pragmatism. If I were to say, well, let's just give a scenario of, if a congregation didn't have the chalice, for instance, I could say to the German Lutheran congregation, hey, let's bring in the chalice. And then the pragmatic argument would be that it's less to clean up. Instead of having to measure out the cups and all this sort of things, you could say this is how, and it's easier to clean, easier to maintain, easier to measure out the wine for the communicants and that sort of thing. And they could say, oh, all right, well, we kind of see that, and then we could go that way. Whereas with the other Lutheran church, that wouldn't really make sense to them. It would be more of a, the chalice is a more better proclamation of the fellowship we have in Christ. And so, when we drink from the one cup as Christ himself instituted with his disciples, take and drink this cup. He didn't divvy out the one cup into all these little cups and say, drink from those cups. He said, here is this cup that you are to drink. Having that more emotional argument behind it, or that they may be interested a bit more in the theological aspect, if we wanted to put it that way too.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's one way of getting at that. I know that we could digress on this for a very long time, but I think that that's a good kind of first crack at like, oh, here's a way of starting to think about this issue. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Let's take a moment to thank our sponsor. If you're listening to this podcast on the go, you already know the power of having audio in your ears. And Audible wants to put the books that you want to listen to there as well, with their free 30-day trial offer that comes with a free audiobook. If you're not sure what book you should check out, this month I'm recommending that you check out Luther's Bondage to the Will. It's one of his great treatises and the one that he looked back on and said was one of the most important. So you can check that out at audibletrial.com/Lutheran Cartographer. Let's get back to our guest. So we've already touched on them, so we may go through these questions quickly, but I want to make sure that we touch on them. So let's talk about, you've already talked about like the family-oriented atmosphere and the welcoming nature of the community. What are some of the other best parts about the Greenleaf area?
So I would say right off the bat, the best part of the Greenleaf area is not only the German background, but this area is heavily LCMS. To put it into perspective this way, so Greenleaf has a population of 307. My congregation, when we were having services before this coronavirus pandemic, we would average about 100 on a weekend. Now that's put into the perspective of Washington County, where Greenleaf is a part of, has a population of about 5,400 total, and there are 6 LCMS congregations in the county, and
wow.
For me specifically, if you were to go, so the vacancy congregation I serve is about 13 miles to the east, and they average about 40 on a Sunday. If you go 6 miles to the west, you're going to get Zion Lutheran, and they have about 120 on a Sunday. You go 6 miles to the south, and you have St. John's and Palmer, which is the mother congregation in the area. They get about 150 on a Sunday. You go even further to the west, and you're going to get to Emmanuel Lutheran, which is about 80 to 90 on a Sunday. And then you go up about 12 miles to the north, and you're going to get Trinity Lutheran in Hanover, which has about 90 to 95 on a Sunday. So you've got these LCMS congregations within a very short distance of each other that have very strong, average attendances on Sunday. There's these are not, when you go out to western Kansas, closer towards Colorado, a lot of those churches are very spread out, and they usually only have about 30 as kind of a high water mark for them. Around here, we have all these congregations with, close to 100 people on Sunday morning. And so, we've got, but then in our circuit, and for those of you, I'm assuming the audience is mostly LCMS Lutheran, but if you're not, a circuit is, the gathering of congregations and pastors in a geographic area. And so our circuit, we actually have 2 parochial schools in our circuit, which is amazing because, again, the county size is not that big. But we have 2 very strong parochial schools in our circuit. And so that's the best thing about it is everyone here is to some degree or another Lutheran for the most part. I mean, there's a Catholic church here and there. There's a couple of ELCA churches, a couple of LCMC churches, offshoot Lutherans from the ELCA. But, maybe a Methodist church here or there, a Christian church. But for the most part, everybody here is Lutheran. And so the common battles that a pastor may have in terms of defending Lutheran doctrine, such as like the practice of closed communion or the practice of against syncretism, joint worship services, ecumenical services and that sort of thing. That's never a battle that we've ever had to have, because everybody here in the area, that's just what we do. And everybody knows that. And so that's not something that we had to stake our claim or plant our flag and say, this is how we do things here as Lutherans, because they've all grown up with that. And most of the generations in these congregations, they don't know anything but that's how we've always done things. Whereas, say if you go to North Dakota and there's not a lot of LCMS Lutherans, there's a lot of ELCA Lutherans up there. They have to defend themselves more often and say, well, no, we're not that kind of Lutheran. We practice this because that's who we are as Lutherans. Around here, everybody knows what we mean when we say Lutheran.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, those are some really good things. Now let's switch. What are some of the worst parts about the area, or the most challenging things about being in Greenleaf?
Well, one of the most challenging things, of course, is you really are kind of, I'm not going to say out in the middle of nowhere, but you really are isolated in a lot of ways, because you have to travel such a great distance to go to, Walmart doesn't seem like that bad when you say, oh, it's only a half hour away. But if you need to get something immediately, and you just went to Walmart yesterday, you're not going to go back because that's another hour that you're going to have to spend to get there and back. You have to, the grocery store here in town, they close at 5 o'clock, so if you don't think of it before 5, well, I guess you're not getting it unless you go to travel the length to get there. Culturally, as I said, that they are a very family, community-oriented group, but it really does take some skill and some time to really involve yourself into the community. And I know as when I came out here, my wife and I, we have 3, children now under the age of 6. And one of the big things is, being out in the community, going out Friday night to see the local sporting events, or going to eat at the American Legion there in Lynn, or, any of the other places that a lot of your, members are going to be at. We just don't get out that much and go around to those places because, well, Friday's always been my time with my family. And so we don't spend much time. So it was hard for us to kind of get into the community, and especially not having any family around, it's hard when, something comes up. If one of our kids gets sick and we need to go to the doctor, then I stay with the other kids, and, we don't just have grandma or grandpa to call up and say, hey, can you come out here and watch our kids for a while? And, something came up, it really can set a wrench in our schedule for the day. But, that's probably the big thing, is you have to really have how can I say that? You really have to have a understanding of what it means to live in rural America. And if you grew up in the city or in the suburbs your whole life, like I did, and then coming out to the rural country, there is a pretty high learning curve there. So that's one thing that I would say. One of the challenges being out here.
That makes sense. All right. So then we've already talked about this a lot, and we are coming up to where we need to start asking some other questions. But I would ask you, would you highlight for our listeners just one thing about that might surprise them or be an unexpectedly good thing about what it's like to raise a family there?
First and foremost, this is it's a great place to raise kids because there are so many opportunities for kids to get involved with other kids outside of school. There's a lot of we do live in a small community, but there are a lot of opportunities in terms of like sports teams. There's basketball, there's baseball, there's all kinds of things going on. The kids can get involved. There's a 4-H chapter out here that's very strong. And again, as I said, in this community, you can guess that 9 out of 10 times the person that you meet is going to be of the same confession as you, Lutherans. And so even our parochial school and the public school have a strong working relationship with each other. And many of the people, if they don't attend the parochial school and they're in the public school, a lot of the teachers and staff and other students are still Lutheran. And so there's, as you had mentioned at the beginning of the program, you find yourself sort of being in a different world in being on the West Coast. You find that here we're isolated from a lot of the more secular or neo-pagan ideas that the world is sort of trying to impose upon our youth as Christians. And so there's not a lot of reprogramming that we have to do in our home because we know that most of the people who are teaching my children, they share the same confession I do. I mean, it seems kind of silly to say, but the only thing we have to worry about a lot of the times is there's the influence of Methodism and evangelicalism here, and so we have to fix that every once in a while. But if that's the worst we have to worry about, then this is a good place to be.
Yes, that that sounds like a great problem to have.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So now let's talk about what you would suggest our listeners check out if they happen to be in the area. Hidden gems or not so hidden gems, places to eat or things to do that you'd recommend.
Certainly. Well, if you come out to Greenleaf in this area, one of the great things to see would be the Alcove Springs, which is it's a tourist area nearby over by Blue Rapids, and one of the claim to fames in this area is that the Pony Express had gone through this area, and so there's a lot of stops and kind of mile markers and things to see. That if you're a history buff, American history, this is a big place for the Pony Express there. So there's all kinds of places to see, mile markers and whatnot. There is, if you look at like cuisine and stuff, and if you go to Marysville, and even Clay Center, there's all kinds of different sorts of barbecue. You have to try the barbecue when you come out here. That's one of the big things. And then if you want to take the travel to Manhattan, they have a Discovery Center, the Flint Hills Discovery Center, where they have all kinds of things for kids. They have all kinds of history about the state of Kansas, sort of the frontier and how the Flint Hills are different than the rest of the state. And there's just all kinds of outdoor stuff to do. One of the big things around here is if you're a hunter, there's lots of turkey hunting, deer hunting. And of course, if you come to visit, anybody here they'll love to give you a ride in the truck, to go check cattle or, ride in the combine and that sort of stuff, and kind of get that sort of off the grid sort of thing would be a really interesting thing as well. But yeah, there's all kinds of things that are really, really something to see out here. We have the Washington County Historical Society out here to talk about a lot of the churches, because of course there's these small churches that they're not open anymore, but you can still see where they used to be. There's a lot of rich church history out here as well. So just to name a few things.
That is fantastic. So as we start closing out the podcast, Pastor Durance, I want to ask you, for those that are thinking about, let's zoom out a little bit, for those that are thinking about, just in general, moving to a more rural location, especially with the coronavirus situation, a lot of people are thinking, I really should be somewhere more rural. What general advice, if people are thinking about moving to rural America, would you have for them?
Well, I'll say right away, one of the things you have to be ready for is, if you're an introverted person like me, you need to step out of your comfort zone, and you need to, be involved with the people in your community. There is a lot of pride in Greenleaf, in Lynn, in Palmer. There's a lot of pride from the people and where they're from. And so, one of the things that we did, foolishly, I would say, I guess, for myself, is when we first came out to Kansas, and we came to Northeast Kansas to our first parish there, we were going to Manhattan every weekend because we wanted to go to the big grocery store and get our food there, and we wanted to go out to eat and do all the stuff that we used to do when we lived in the seminary in the Twin Cities. And even when we lived back in Michigan, my wife and I both came from fairly large suburban towns in Michigan. And so that was the one thing we were really involved in. And we didn't really go to, a lot of the community events at first. We didn't go to the local grocery store to get a lot of the stuff we needed to do. I mean, we did in a pinch if we had to, but we really were trying to hold on to that, suburban lifestyle of, well, we want to do this. We want to go to the big chain restaurants. We want to go to Target. We want to do all that kind of stuff. And we did that every weekend, and we were gone out of the community most of the time. And then when we came out here after spending some time in rural America, he said, we really did enjoy being part of, the community. So, for instance, last year, there's a large dairy company, Oldie Dairy, here in the area in our community. And they have in the month of June, which is National Dairy Month, they gave away a free gallon of milk. And they had a whole big thing at the dairy where you could see and look like, hey, have you ever wondered where your milk comes from? This is how it's done. They had games. They had a free lunch that they gave to the community. I mean, they just opened it up to everybody. You could come and grab a couple of hamburgers or hot dogs or whatever and, grab a free gallon of milk and then be on your way home. And there's a lot of things, especially in the time of this pandemic. The community's really been stepping up. Our local grocery store, Cromie's Market, has been doing a giveaway where they've been collecting donations from people, monetary donations, and they've been live streaming on Facebook, delivering a box of groceries to a family. The people here, they nominated a family. The owners of the grocery store packed up about $100 worth of groceries in a cardboard box, and they live streamed, driving to this family and presented them with a box of groceries. And so, that's still going on to the best of my knowledge. But there's just an incredible amount of families that have been helped by that. And so that's one of the things, if you want to come to the country in the rural America, that's one of the things is be involved with the community. They take a lot of pride in where they're from, and you can really feel that. I mean, even in just the small little mom and pop stores and this sort of thing, you feel the pride that they have, and they pour their heart and soul into pretty much everything they do, including being in their churches. And so that's what I would suggest is be ready for that and be willing to be a part of that. Be involved is what you could say.
All right, that sounds like the good advice. So now let's turn to what things you'd like to point our listeners towards. Your church website or places to follow you online. What would you like our listeners to check out?
Certainly. So we have a Facebook page for both of the congregations, Bethlehem Lutheran Church, Greenleaf. St. Peter's Lutheran, Barnes, Barnes. And then I also work with the Kansas district of the Missouri Synod as the district life coordinator. So if you go to kslcms.org and go under the president's page, there's a life ministry page. And so we've been doing a district life conference here every January with other LCMS Lutherans in the district in our proclamation of life. And so there's that option there. And then also our church websites are on our Facebook pages and for any additional information that you would like to know.
All right, fantastic. Thank you again for your time today, Pastor Durance. What are your parting thoughts for our listeners?
I would say, I've talked about the pride in the community here. And I would have to say that for myself, I take a lot of great pride in being part of this tradition, being part of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And I hope that your listeners, if they are LCMS, that they feel that pride as well. We have a great treasure in our synod and the consolation of the gospel. And if you're just kind of tuning in and listening, check out your local LCMS parish and talk to that pastor and see, listen to them, because I think that we have a great treasure that we need to share with others. And if you've ever considered this church, please do so. We would love to have you.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Godspeed.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Lutheran Cartographer. For more about the things that we talked about today, check out the show notes page at lutherancartographer.com/22 for all those great things that Pastor Durance told us about. Before you go, I want to encourage you to check out that Audible offer. You get to keep that free audiobook even if you decide not to continue with their service, but it's well worth checking out. That's at audibletrial.com/lutherancartographer. Be sure and subscribe to the show on iTunes and on Stitcher so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd really appreciate it if you'd leave me a rating and a review. That way more people can see the podcast. Thanks again for listening. I'm Nicholas Weber, and I'll talk to you soon.